This is a scene of Jews during World War II. A German officer randomly picked some people out. Then he ordered them to lie on the ground. This scene is from the movie The Pianist, based on a true story. The film tells the story of a Jewish pianist who repeatedly escaped Nazi massacres, with his last escape being nothing short of a miracle. Late that night, the family was enjoying a delicious soup when suddenly they heard noises from across the street. The Nazis had come. The family across the street was so scared that they immediately turned off their lights, and the Władysław's family quickly did the same. Then they heard furious shouts from across the street. The Nazis appeared at a house across from them. Like the Władysław's family, these people were also eating. The Nazis ordered everyone to stand up, but one elderly man refused because he was disabled. Moments later, the elderly man was thrown from the upper floor. Then the Nazis forced the family out onto the street and made them run. They then shot them all, leaving no one alive. This man was the Władysław, who had just escaped the Nazi massacre twice. The family drinking soup just now was his. Despite his talent, he was still out of work, because their capital had been occupied by the Nazis. Not only the Władysław but his entire 6-member family was unemployed. That day, his father was counting all their savings, a total of 5,003 Polish zloty. But worse still, the Nazis were figuring out ways to deprive them of their property. They decreed that a Jewish family could only possess 2,000 zloty. Any extra money had to be deposited in a German bank, or it would be confiscated. Of course, the family didn't want to hand over their money, so they began thinking of ways to hide it. Helena suggested hiding it under the flower pot, but their father said that during World War I, people would drill a hole in the table leg to hide money. Regina suggested that the most dangerous place was the safest. He proposed putting the money directly on the table and covering it with a random newspaper. The Władysław also came up with an idea. He would hide the money inside the seams of the violin. A few months later, the Nazi anti-Jewish policies escalated. They not only wanted to strip the Jews of their property but also of their dignity. All Jews had to wear white armbands. The Władysław's father, walking on the street, was beaten for not bowing to the Nazis and was even forbidden to walk on the sidewalk.
Euch ist der Gehweg verboten. Nimm die Gosse mit dir.
The noose tightened little by little. Next, the Nazis started a terrifying plan to take Jewish lives. The Władysław's harrowing escape began. On October 31, 1940, 500,000 Polish Jews were forced to leave their homes and move to the ghetto, surrounded by walls. From now on, the biggest problem was no longer discrimination but survival. 500,000 Poles formed a village within the city, reverting entirely to the law of the jungle. People collapsed on the streets at any time, and black market trading was rampant as everyone starved. The two brothers were forced to go out and sell family possessions for cheap. When they returned home, their mother said a man named Heller had visited. He was also a Jew but was dressed neatly and clearly someone of status. Heller told the Władysław that the ghetto was recruiting policemen and asked if he and his brother were interested. The job offered good benefits, and the family wouldn't have to worry about food anymore. The youthful Henrik scoffed and refused to be a cohort of the Germans and oppress his own people.
Somebody's got to do it, Henrik.
But if they didn't do it, someone else would. The Władysław, being a craftsman, occasionally played the piano in a restaurant. It was a gathering place for high-class Jews. On his way home, the Władysław passed the ghetto wall and saw people constantly throwing things over it. They were children, small enough to squeeze through gaps, but not all of them returned safely. The child was halfway out of the wall, being brutally beaten by the Germans on the other side. By the time the Władysław managed to pull the child over, he had already stopped breathing. The Władysław left in unbearable pain. But this was just the beginning. Even more horrific events were yet to come. After dinner, they heard the sound of car engines. A group of German soldiers broke into a house across the street, leading to the scene shown at the beginning of the film. Fortunately, the Władysław was relatively lucky. The Nazis did not break into their home. After experiencing the tragedy, the Władysław was disheartened even when playing the piano. At that moment, Regina suddenly found him and said that Henrik had been captured by the Nazis. The Władysław had no choice but to ask the Jewish police for help. The officer responded coldly, saying, "Didn't you refuse to join us back then?" However, seeing the talented artist begging, he eventually helped, and Henrik was released. But at that moment, an elderly man on the street suddenly grabbed a woman's pot. They both struggled desperately, and the elderly man immediately lay on the ground, frantically licking the food. He was so hungry that he had reverted to animal instincts, while the woman could only cry helplessly, hitting him with her hat. Without that porridge, she might starve to death tomorrow. In March 1942, the suffering of the Jews escalated again. The Nazis first confiscated all their luggage and then herded them together. At night, a German officer ordered everyone to gather outside, then picked them out one by one. A woman softly asked a question.
Wohin bringen Sie uns?
Before long, The family was to be sent to a concentration camp. A large number of people were driven to the square, and the Władysław soon arrived there as well. Now, any separation made people nervous. Soon, a child selling candies appeared. The father used the last 20 Polish zloty to buy a candy bar, cutting it with a knife to give each family member a piece. In this film, 3 family meals are depicted, each one worse than the last. The first meal was rich in ingredients. The second time, they only had soup. The third time, only a piece of candy was left. But what they didn't know was that this was their last meal. The train arrived, and they began to board. On the roadside, a Jewish policeman saw the Władysław and pulled him out. The Władysław wanted to run back to his family, but the policeman stopped him. His father looked at him, not daring to let him come back, only waving goodbye. The Władysław escaped once again, but from then on, he was alone. Although he survived, he had nothing left. He arrived at his home, but it was already filled with corpses, and the square was full of luggage left behind. He walked into a cafe, and suddenly a voice called out to him. It was the restaurant manager telling him to hide together. The Władysław escaped the roundup again. The manager told him that he had bribed a German policeman and that they would be rescued once things calmed down. After hiding for about 2 days, the Władysław and the restaurant manager finally came out. It seemed that quite a few people had bribed German policemen. They were taken away to work as laborers. But were they safe now? One day, after finishing his work, the Władysław was about to leave when a German officer suddenly appeared. He looked very angry and randomly picked out some old and weak people, making them lie down and then shot them one by one. Unfortunately, the manager who had saved the Władysław was killed. A few days later, the Władysław met a Jewish man named Majorek. Majorek told the Władysław that their compatriots had been secretly sent to a place called a concentration camp. Trains went there full and came back empty. It didn't look good. Majorek was rebellious. They had secretly gathered people to prepare for resistance. Along the way, countless compatriots helped the Władysław, so he naturally could not refuse at this moment. One day, the Władysław was working when suddenly a large wave of fighter jets appeared in the sky. The Władysław, momentarily distracted, knocked over some bricks, and the Nazi below called him down. The Władysław hurried down, but his legs were already trembling with fear. He thought he was doomed and was whipped unconscious by the Nazi, but he was lucky not to be killed. His co-workers knew he was the famous Władysław, so they managed to get him a less strenuous job. Shortly after, the resistance plan took a turn. An officer told the Jews that to motivate them to work, they would send someone to town to fetch potatoes every day. After work, each person could get 3 kilograms of potatoes and a loaf of bread. This policy gave the resistance an opportunity. The resistance started hiding weapons in the potatoes, and the Władysław was responsible for receiving them. When returning to the dormitory after work, he would seize the chance to throw the weapons to comrades outside the wall. Soon, the Władysław's actions raised suspicion, and he had to escape the ghetto or face certain death. Majorek told the Władysław that escaping was easy, but surviving was difficult. Majorek soon found a contact for the Władysław. The time finally came. The Władysław secretly took off and discarded his armband. Jews and Poles were working as laborers, so the Władysław mingled with the Polish group and escaped. The Władysław then found an old friend, the famous Polish singer Janina. Janina and her husband took him in, lying in the bathtub. The Władysław felt at peace for the first time in many days and fell asleep. But he was quickly woken up because the Nazis had started another round of searches. He couldn't stay long. He changed his clothes, which Janina burned. The Władysław ate hastily, but before he finished his meal, he had to leave. Janina and her husband told the Władysław to find a man named Laskzik. Laskzik would arrange a place for the Władysław to stay. Soon, the Władysław arrived at an apartment. Having been confined to the ghetto for over 2 years, life outside the walls made him very anxious. When Laskzik left, he gave the Władysław an address, saying that he could seek help there in an emergency. The Władysław lay on the bed, finally able to sleep. But suddenly, he heard a couple flirting and faint piano music from the next apartment. At this point, the Władysław smiled, regaining a sense of being alive. But the peace was short-lived. It was now April 1943. Germany's Operation Barbarossa to conquer the Soviet Union had failed, marking a turning point on the European front. The explosions outside indicated that the Jews had started to resist. Soon, the resistance fighters reached the building, engaging in guerrilla warfare with German soldiers. The gunfire lasted several days. The resistance was very tenacious, but in the end, they were defeated by the better armed and more numerous Germans. Survivors were executed on the spot. Later, the Władysław told Janina about the uprising, questioning its significance. Janina replied that they died with dignity, and inspired by them, the Poles would also resist. However, a few days later, the Władysław received news that Janina and her husband had been arrested. Laskzik urged the Władysław to run, But the Władysław didn't want to. Laskzik said, when the Nazis stormed the apartment, you should jump to your death rather than let them capture you alive. Soon, the sound of German vehicles approached, and German shouting echoed in the hallway. The Władysław quickly opened the window, preparing to jump, but he was too scared to jump. Fortunately, it was a false alarm. The Germans took the residents downstairs and were not there to capture him. If possible, the Władysław wanted to stay in this apartment until the war ended, but even if he lay still every day, he couldn't go without food. One night, he came out to find something to eat and accidentally broke a stack of dishes. Immediately, there was a knock on the door. The person outside warned him that if he didn't open the door, they would call the police. The Władysław quickly packed his things and left. At the door, he encountered an irritable Polish woman who immediately recognized him as a Jew. The Władysław fled at once. Now, in the most dangerous moment, the Władysław could only go to the emergency contact address given by Laskzik. To his surprise, the door was opened by Dorota, a woman he had been romantically involved with 3 years ago. Dorota's swollen belly indicated she was pregnant, but the Władysław was nearly starving to death and couldn't afford to reminisce. He humbly apologized and begged for a piece of bread. Soon, Dorota's husband took the Władysław to an apartment in the German district, right across from a hospital and the Nazi SS headquarters. This was the so-called darkest place under the lamp, the most dangerous place being the safest. To be safe, Dorota's husband locked the Władysław in the room. Food would be delivered regularly, and he was instructed to remain as quiet as possible. There was a piano in the room. He sat down and played it passionately. The significance of music could exist solely in the heart. Thus, a few months passed. Dorota's husband brought a man named Marek, saying he would take care of the Władysław from now on. Now, the Allies were bombing Germany, and the hard times were coming to an end. But the Władysław's happiness was premature. Marek was very unreliable, often disappearing for 2 or 3 weeks. When he did show up, he would cry poverty and say he had no money to buy things. The Władysław gave him his watch, but Marek suddenly disappeared for a long time after that. The Władysław rationed his potatoes, saving them until they sprouted. Finally, he removed the sprouts and ate them. Not long after, Dorota and her husband visited the Władysław again and found him lying in bed, starving and barely alive. Dorota originally wanted to say goodbye before moving to her mother's hometown. From her, the Władysław learned that Marek had been collecting money under the pretense of helping the Władysław and then ran off with it. Under Dorota's care, the Władysław recovered somewhat. Dorota also had to leave, and the Władysław was once again alone. Time moved to August 1944. The Allies were landing in Normandy. Soon, the Polish uprising began downstairs. Explosions and gunfire echoed throughout the city all night, with rocket launchers firing directly below. With the start of the gunfight, no one delivered food anymore, and even the water supply stopped. The Władysław looked out the window and saw a female soldier running frantically before being shot and kneeling on the ground. Gunfire was frequent in the building, and the Germans brought in tanks. The Władysław no longer had to worry about the locked door. The tank had created an opening for him. Through this hole, he climbed to the neighboring rooftop to evade the Germans. He hid on the rooftop. The Germans inside didn't find him, but the Germans across the way did. The Władysław fell, but luckily there was a balcony below. He continued his escape, but he was hungry and thirsty, drinking dirty water when he found it. He hid for several days until the Germans started burning everything in their path. In a panic, the Władysław jumped out the window. The insignificance of life and the brutality of war rendered any dialogue unnecessary. He couldn't afford to lament the invisible fate. He was now as thin as paper, driven by animal instincts to find food. Finally, he found a can. But suddenly, he heard the voices of Germans. He ran upstairs, hid in the attic, and pulled up the ladder so no one could follow. At night, the Władysław was so hungry that he couldn't stand it. He sneaked down to open the can, but he no longer had the strength, and the can accidentally fell to the ground. He tried to bend down to pick it up, but the next second, he froze. A German Nazi wearing military boots was standing in front of him, but this German seemed somewhat different. He asked the Władysław what he was doing, if he lived here, and what he used to do. When Wilm learned that the man in front of him was the piano genius, he brought him to the piano in the living room and told him to play. The Władysław sat down, his fingers trembling. It was the first time he had touched a piano in nearly 5 years. He played Chopin's Ballade No. 1, a piece imbued with Chopin's love for his homeland, and the Władysław expressed the same emotions. The Władysław was very hungry, but for a musician, the notes were a stimulant. Under the moonlight, the haggard and thin the Władysław had a special beauty. He played more and more immersively, slowly forgetting his situation and falling into the world of art. His fingers moved faster and faster, expressing his anger through the music. When he finished, Wilm stood up and adjusted his uniform. This small gesture showed Wilm's great respect for the piano genius in front of him. Wilm asked the Władysław if he was Jewish, and the Władysław did not answer. Finally, Wilm led the Władysław to his hiding place in the attic and guided him with a flashlight. This event left the Władysław feeling conflicted. He never expected a German Nazi to be so kind. It turned out that the Władysław's hiding place was a temporary Nazi command post, and Wilm was the officer in charge. From then on, Wilm became the Władysław's protector, quietly bringing him food, bread, jam, and even a knife to open cans. Eating the bread, the Władysław felt a rare sense of satisfaction. The time came to January 1945, and the outside world was still full of gunfire. The Soviets were crossing the Vistula River, and Wilm predicted that they would be liberated in at most 2 weeks, asking the Władysław to wait a few more days. The actual progress of the war was faster than expected. The Soviets captured Warsaw in just 5 days. On the day the Germans retreated, Wilm came one last time to bring food and say goodbye to the Władysław. Before leaving, he asked for the Władysław's name, saying he might hear his live performance someday. He also left his coat to keep the Władysław from freezing to death. Soon, a car with a Polish flag arrived, and the Władysław excitedly went downstairs, only to be met with bullets. It turned out that it was all because of the German coat he was wearing. After finally explaining everything, the Władysław survived the war and played the piano once again. In 1950, a friend who played the violin found him, saying he had met a German officer in a POW camp. The officer asked him to tell the Władysław that he had provided shelter during the war and hoped the Władysław could help him. The friend didn't catch Wilm's name clearly, and finding someone among tens of thousands of POWs without a name was like looking for a needle in a haystack. In the end, the Władysław never found Wilm. The German officer's real name was Wilm Hosenfeld. Not only did he help the Władysław, but it was confirmed that he had helped over 50 Jews. In 1952, he died in a POW camp. It wasn't until 2009 that he was posthumously honored as righteous among the nations, while the Władysław lived until he was 88. Finally, let's hope that in this world, music will be louder than gunfire, and art will outlast war. I'm a movie lover. Welcome to subscribe to my channel. See you next time.